English, Linguistics, and MLL 191, The World of Language, Cultural, and Social Aspects, with me, your professor, Professor Chung. Hopefully, if you are watching this video, you are already enrolled in the course and you're good to go. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me. So we're going to get started with the agenda for the course. I do want to give an overview um, of introductions for those of you who haven't taken the course with me. I do also want to go over what the course will be about and also the topic of the week, which is language. So a little bit about me. You may know me either in person or maybe you've heard me virtually from the mini courses at UMBC that I have taught. So in addition to this one, I have taught MLL 190, English 100, English 226. I have also taught at the ELI, the English Language Institute at UMBC, and I'm also a UMBC PhD student. So many different departments. I'm involved at least 3 or 4 different parts of UMBC. So I'm very, very well known with the Retrievers. I'm not from Maryland, unfortunately. I am a native North Carolinian. I speak English, Southern English. My native language is Cantonese, which you'll figure out with the linguistic autobiography. And I've lived primarily on the East Coast. I've lived in North Carolina, I've lived in Maryland, Baltimore, I lived in Catonsville. I lived in Washington, D.C., and currently I live in Northern Virginia. About my educational background, I have a bachelor's in English education ESL from my alma mater, NC State. This is where I also received a master's in English sociolinguistics. So that was kind of the bulk of the presentations that I will give, is grounded in my study of sociolinguistics. I'm also about to finish a PhD in the Language Literacy and Culture program at UMBC. So I'm very, very happy to be almost done. I know some of you who are seniors who are taking my class, you probably feel the same way. And I also have experience teaching at all different levels in education. So, for example, I was a high school English teacher for a little bit in Leesville Road High School in Raleigh, North Carolina. After that, I taught at Beijing Royal School, that was in China, taught in Guatemala, and I also taught elementary school ESL at Partnership Elementary, that's also in Raleigh, North Carolina. Um, so all across the gamut, including high school, into college. I taught at CCBC as well for those of you who have transferred from CCBC into UMBC. Very familiar. Taught at the Catonsville campus and also online at CCBC Dundalk. Currently, I am the academic writing coordinator for National Defense University. It is part of Department of Defense. And I also served as communication intern for Linguistic Society of America. So this is the premier organization for linguists all over the United States and abroad. So I have a wealth of experience teaching English and linguistics and ESL. And for everyone who says you shouldn't study linguistics because you'll never find a job, or what will you do with a bachelor's in French or Turkish, I always say there you will always have money. You will always find a job, This is something that people really covet, someone who's able to learn, communicate, speak other languages, know other languages, and just being able to be flexible in this regard is a very high quality trait that a lot of people kind of look down upon. But I'm here to say that this is not only, something that's coveted monetarily, but something that will, I think, continue to make the world a better place. So you probably received my emails from me. If you haven't, check your inbox. But what is due for your first assignment is a linguistic autobiography assignment. For those of you who had me as a professor before, I usually make everyone do this because I think it's a good exercise and it's also a good way to get to know you as an individual. But so this is where you kind of follow the prompt and you tell me about your linguistic background and kind of where you're from. So you can there's questions that I have, and I also have my own example to guide you. If you have taken my class before and you already have a linguistic autobiography, don't worry about it. You can repost it again. It won't be considered plagiarism, since I know not much of your background has probably changed since the last time you took my course. For those of you who are new to my class, please do that for your first assignment. So these are some goals in which we'll get out of the course. A lot of you have, if you've taken my classes before, you kind of understand what language is. Don't worry, we won't be dissecting any syntax trees in this class. This class is really more about the social and cultural aspects of language, how language works, and how it varies. We'll be talking about the relationship between language and society, especially language and politics, language in media, how people use language used in different contexts, but we'll also consider the relationship between language and identity. What is, for example, how does gender influence your language? How does race influence your language? How does your ethnicity influence your language? So these will be mostly the focus of this course. So obviously, this is an online course, which means that each week you're required to have completed the readings before the assignment due date, and also complete assignments on Blackboard. So for the readings, I will have mostly readings from the textbook. So this is Mooney and Evans. This is available online. It's available also in the UMBC bookstore, I believe. But I believe in making text available for everybody. So I'm going to try to find an online copy and post it onto Blackboard for you. Because I don't know. I kind of want you to be spending your money on things that are important to you and not on textbooks. Not that textbooks are important to you, but there's also other readings from that I will post on Blackboard that comes from the syllabus. So just follow the syllabus for all the required readings. This is also on the syllabus, but I do want to just reiterate that this course is asynchronous. So you can, the benefit of this course is that you can complete your discussion boards at any time of the week as long as you complete them by the end, right? So, and I think it is in your best interest to complete them early, because you also need to have responses to your peers. So you'll need to have responses to your post. You must at least have, and you must at least have two responses that you give to your peers. This is just to ensure that we have a robust discussion going on online. I know for an online course, we're not able to see each other. We're not all coming, at the same time. We're all not listening to me talk and, at one specific time. And so to make sure that everyone is kind of on board and participating in the lectures and participating in the discussion and making sure the discussions are relevant, this is what I require as a nature of this course. Now, remember, if this isn't for you, there's also other sections of MLL 191. I think there's another section of LL 190 that might be more synchronous, and that you can go and take the course at a specific time. That I know that helps a lot of people. But the main point of taking an online course is so that you can make sure your assignments are due when they're supposed to be due. So just check the syllabus, make sure that you have your assignments. I'll try to send out email reminders, although, sometimes I forget, or sometimes, I'm reading your discussion board post and I assume that everyone else has done it. So, just as a reminder, I would recommend putting all these dates on the calendar, either an online calendar or physical calendar, because, just being able to make sure that you complete the assignments in a timely manner is very important to passing this course. And so, with that, because it is, it's kind of time intensive to not only watch these lectures every week, think about them, do the readings, respond to your post. Sorry, respond to your posts, and then also, make sure that you have responses to other people's posts. That's a lot of things to do. So, I require no exams and no quizzes for this course. There is, however, a final paper, which I will discuss in just a little bit. So, one thing that I'm very, very particular on is the word limit. So, there is a required word limit of 300 words for your posts on the discussion board. And so, you'll have one post every week, and every post should have at least 300 words. Now, it's okay if you go over, I don't mind if you go over, but I've taught UMBC, I've taught different places, and I know, you know, um, Polonius from Hamlet says brevity is the soul of wit, but I just haven't really seen any discussion board posts that have been like really striking to me or, life changing, that have been, like less than 300 words. So just try to maintain, this word limit, and I'll at least have some sort of discussion board post or, a discussion point at the end of every lecture to kind of jumpstart your thinking about them. So that will hopefully help you. So here's an example of, what is like a good post, right? So, the student is responding to, what are some new linguistic words that have been used, and they're using good terms. They're using terms from the textbook. They're using terms from their readings. Maybe they're referencing their readings. Maybe they're, addressing some of their peers. Maybe they're asking a question. So this would be an example of a post that, you're reading this and your peers will be like, oh, okay, let me respond to this. That's something to where, you need to craft these responses that you find are authentic, good learning points, but also something very interesting or something that will grab your reader. So what's was an example of a good post. So your post must be 300 words, and also your responses must be at least 150 words. So this is an example of a response. This person's asking a question. This person's definitely decided to read through their peers' responses or their posts before offering a response. They're offering maybe a different opinion, right? Sometimes the posts that I read are sometimes like, oh yeah, great job, like I agree with you. Those aren't really great posts, and like even if you do agree with them, it doesn't really add anything to this person's thinking, right? So you want to further the conversation, and that is something to where I challenge you. As a UBC student, as a retriever, you should be very good at challenging your peers. So participation on the discussion boards, engagement with the material, referencing the readings, is very important. I also mentioned these things on the syllabus, just making sure that you are timely. You're going with the flow, you're providing excellent content, and then if I know there might be some times in which you might be late with your discussion board posts. Just make sure that you automatically go through and do it as soon as you remember. So, the lateness, I won't dock off necessarily, if it's one or two times, but if it's a continual lateness, you're really not going to get those quality responses from your peers if you're late because they've already moved on to another topic. So, I recommend that you get your posts ahead of time. And just stick to the schedule on the syllabus. So for the final essay, I'll discuss about it a little bit later, but it really can be anything you learn from this course. So, for example, if we're going to talk about language and region, and we're going to talk about the many dialects spoken in Maryland and beyond, and you think like, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating to me. You can write your paper on that. If you, for example, you are in computer engineering and you're very interested in the role of natural language processing and artificial intelligence, you can write your paper on that. So anything that you think about with language, I think will be okay. So some caveats that I have with this is that sometimes the students, they try to pass off another paper from another course and say, oh yeah, this has something to do with language. And sometimes I mean, it's a very hard stretch, sometimes. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe you just pass this off as another paper. So I require now everyone to send me an email. This is kind of closer to the end of the semester with what you think you'll write about for your final paper. What are some topics that you'll find interesting? And then you can email me. So, really, the only things I require is that it has to be language related, maybe something that we talked about in the lectures, 5 pages, and by 5 pages I mean the end of the fifth page. I'm very, very, very strict about that. 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch doc, and please share it with my email in a Google Doc. My email is chu7@umbc.edu. And then here are the grading requirements. So as you can see, over half of the grades of how you'll be graded has to do with the online discussion board posts, how well you post. And then less than half will be the final page paper related to your topic of choice related to language. Okay, so if you have any questions about the syllabus, please email me to get some clarification. So we're going to jumpstart into our lecture about language. What is language? So based on the readings in the textbook and based on, if you guys have taken MLL 190 with me, we talk about how language is particularly human, purely human. Edward Sapir, we'll talk about him later in regards to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But he really came out and said, language is something that we as humans developed. Not to say that animals can't communicate or like dogs don't understand everything I'm saying, but we have a very intrinsic way of communicating ideas that no other species has. We have a ways of what Saussure says, we have a system of signs. We have a method in which we ascribe meaning to these signs. And then Noam Chomsky came out a little bit later and said, okay, it's not just these ideas or these symbols or these signs. It's a set of finite or infinite sentences, each finite in length and constructed of a finite set of elements. So Chomsky is more of a generative linguist in which he believed that most of we're humans are born with language, but we're born with the capacity of a language acquisition device. That means everyone who is born, um, you know, is able to learn language, but it has limits, and those limits are, depending on where you come from and depending on, where you live or who your caretakers are, who is speaking to you. These are elements in which it's not just you just picking up, a certain language. You are a product of the conditions in which you're born, and Chomsky would argue that it is an innate device. So Mooney and Evans, your textbook, will say that it's more of a system. It's a system of different signs and different structures that really promote how language is being used. For the purposes of this class, I would like to use this language or this definition, which is language is a system of spoken, written, or signed communication used by a particular country, people, community, typically consisting of words used within a regular grammatical and syntactic structure. So this definition I think is really good because it kind of encompasses everything that Sapir and Chomsky and all their textbook writers have talked about, but it kind of puts it in a more layman term. So it is a system, like Mooney and Evans say, right? But it is used for communication and is used by particular people, right? Or a community, or could be a country, could be, a series of people on the internet, right? But it also consists of a grammatical and syntactic structure. There is a rule-based system for using language, and we'll talk a little bit about what grammatical means in a linguistic sense. So, how do we know? What do we know when we know a language? We know the rules of the system, right? So, someone has always asked me, like, oh, if I know how to say, um, hello in all these different languages. Like, does that mean I'm fluent in all these different languages? And, I say, okay, well, you know how to say, for example, aloha, right? Does that mean that you know Hawaiian? Um, and linguists would say probably not unless you know the rules of a system, unless you can communicate effectively with a person. And I would say unless you can dream in that language, right? But fluency is something that is contested. So when people talk about language, what it means that they, if I say I know Spanish, right? That means that I agree on the rules of Spanish. I agree that adjectives, follow nouns or something like that. That is something to where, you know, you when you agree on a language, when you say you speak a language, this is something to where you're complicitly agreeing to the rules of a language as well. So in your readings, you'll probably understand some of the properties of language, and these are what makes language very different from communication, especially animal communication. So what is it that makes humans different, and our way of speaking very different from the ways in which bees communicate or dance, right? And so, one of those is that language is arbitrary. And what we mean by arbitrary is that the word that we have for certain objects or things, people, places, nouns, right, is differs all around the world. So, for example, this picture, of something like what would you call this thing in your language? Some people would say dog. Some people would say perro. Sorry for my Spanish. Some people would say chien. Sorry for my French. Some people say gal, right? Some people say doge, right? From the internet, like an internet dog, right? So there's nothing about this picture in particular that warrants a response. We are assigning meanings to these symbols. And sign language is a very good example of this, in which the sign language that we have in the United States, mostly, we have different dialects of sign language, but, normally, people who use sign, sometimes they'll use American Sign Language, right? But that kind of sign is very different from people in Britain who use British Sign Language. Those signs, it might be referring to the same thing, same word, but they're very, very different signs. Languages also allow for open ended creativity. Every single, there's probably a new word being created right now. These are just some words from this past year that I've heard. The American Dialect Society actually comes out with the word of the year, and so I have a link to the word of the year if you want to find out what the word of the year is for this year. But the thing about language is, or human language, is that we can already create new words to describe a concept. And this is something that's very different from birds. So birds, we know birds chirp. Birds can even have dialects actually, but birds can't really create new songs. They're kind of programmed to have certain response signals to certain songs. The same thing for bees. Like, can bees create new dances every year? At least for the as frequently as humans can. That would be something that's very contested. So yeah, so I would highly recommend that kind of look at these words, or if you don't know what they mean, look them up. Fan, bet, doom scrolling, receipts, woke, sus, fire, lumber, sexual, slay, stand, simp, drippin'. And then, some people would say we assign words to signs. Some people would say that we're going back to signs and the use of emojis. So, I don't even have to explain this in terms for you to know that this is an emoji for dumpster fire or trash fire, right? A lot of people thought, this past year was trash fire. So, this is an accurate emoji for some, and some people already have this shared connection. And that's what language is. It's kind of a shared connection. You're kind of agreeing on the same rules, right? About how to put certain constructs together. And so that's one area in which language is very different from communication. Here's a term, on not only creativity, but a means in which language can be used to dictate different meanings. So this sentence, buffalo, 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 has meaning. And the meaning means bison from the city of New York State, which others of their kind intimidate, do the same to still others of their kind. This is a legitimate sentence. Now, would I ever utter it in another sentence, like a random sentence? Probably not. But, this is kind of speaking to the ingenuity of language, how people are able to put different constructs together and have meaning. Language also allows for expression of unfamiliar meaning. So, for example, when Hmong speakers, these are peoples from originally from Laos or Vietnam, they settled in the United States, and they had to create some new words for the different objects and experiences they encountered. So, they came up with this word, right? Chok mo. And so this came from cha, which means place, ko, which means fix, and then mo, which means sickness, a place to fix the sickness. So, what do you think this word means? It means hospital, right? And a lot of people ask me, why didn't they have a hospital? Why didn't they have a word for hospital? And that's because in their culture, if someone got sick, they would have a shaman or like kind of a tribal leader come to their house and kind of fix the sickness. And so when they came to America, they said, okay, we need a new word for this kind of place where everyone goes when they're sick, right? And so this is how they're able to use this, kind of what Chomsky's saying, when you have a set of meanings and you're able to kind of put them together, kind of like Lego blocks, to create other meanings. Language also allows for production of vast numbers of combinations, also called recursions. So, think of a sentence, right? You can use a sentence I have here, but if you think of a sentence, you can make that sentence as long as you want. So you can say just exactly like father. If father had known as much about the night before I went out. You could say Faulkner wrote blah 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 blah, or you could say I think that Faulkner wrote blah 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 blah, or you could say you think that I think that Faulkner wrote blah 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 blah. So you can kind of recursion means you're taking these combinations and you're just expanding them, expanding them, expanding them, and that you can create an infinite number of words this way, or infinite number of sentences this way. And again, that's something to where birds can do, dogs can do. This is something that is uniquely human. So, what is linguistics? Linguistics is the study of language. And when we're studying language, we're not just picking up languages, as we're not just saying, okay, I'm a linguist, I speak French and Portuguese and Italian and Indonesian. Some linguists do that. Some people, for example, in the military, they will, if they're a linguist, they are known for speaking a language, right? But most other linguists, they actually study the science of a language, and they try to understand what the rules are. So why would they do this? Well, it could have a lot of different impacts in various fields. So, for example, cognitive linguists, a lot of the diseases that occur because of brain damage result in things like aphasia, where you might not have the capacity for speech. And so a lot of cognitive scientists try to look at, cognitive linguists, sorry, try to look at, why might that be? What is it? How is language housed in your brain, and how does that affect the ways in which you learn things? Or if you have suffer from brain damage, how does that affect your speech? There could also be, structural, theoretical linguists, sociolinguistics, which is what I got my master's in, applied linguistics, which is kind of like what I'm doing now, psycholinguistics, neurolinguistics, computational linguists, people who, are trying to make artificial intelligence, for example, like how do you mimic human speech, right? So, how linguists study the system depends on what part we're interested in. you know, um, in addition to maybe making a lot of money and accruing fame and glory, linguistics can also help you, in a time of extremism, right? So this is one of my mentors from North Carolina State. He got called in by CNN. They asked him if he could ID someone who was in the ISIS video. So this man was an extremist, but he was kind of like born in America, and based on his speech patterns, my professor said, "Oh, yes, this guy is from the Midwest." And he could pinpoint exactly what town, what city, what region he's from based on his accent. There was a quiz like a while ago. It's like a New York Times quiz, but it kind of did the same thing where you'd answer a bunch of questions and it would say, "Hey, you live in Dundalk." And people would be like, "Wow, how did you know I lived in Dundalk?" And that is because Dundalk has a different way of speaking that other parts of America doesn't, right? So, this is something to where you could help out. And this is, my one of my students said, maybe one of your students will catch the next big threat. Because an FBI profiler said linguistic work was pivotal in capturing the Unabomber. So, what is linguistic competence? Your textbook kind of talked about this a little bit. Competence can mean different things. So, it could either be grammatical competence or communicative competence. Grammatical competence means understanding the rules or the grammar of a language, but I'm saying that in quotes. You can't see me doing air quotes right now, but how do how linguists use the word grammar is very broad, and it means very differently than people who like me. I'm an English teacher, I'm a linguist, but as an English teacher I would use the word grammar very differently than I would a linguist, right? And I'll show you in a little bit what that means. Communicative competence means that being able to communicate in the language effectively, being able to be understood, and they're not the same thing. Why not? Because grammatical competence can take the form of different ways in which you might not be subscribing to the rules of a certain language, but you could still be understood. And the same thing for the opposite. So, for example, there's a lot of different dialects that are grammatically competent because even if they don't subscribe to quote the language rules, but they're still able to communicate effectively. So, what does it mean for something to be grammatically competent? This is a photo. It's taken in the H Mart in Cary, North Carolina, and it says, "Idea can happen in the most unlikely places." Restroom. So, a lot of people posted this on my Facebook because they thought it was funny, right? And a lot of people said, "Oh, it's grammatically incorrect because it says idea instead of ideas can happen." Do you just have one idea in the restroom? No, you have multiple ideas in the restroom, right? But people would argue that, this is grammatically competent. This is something to where, um, someone can say this as part of their dialect. I would say that this is probably a misspelling, right? It is communicatively competent, but if you wanted to, be more grammatically competent, you could say things like five idea, right, without an S. That would be something that's grammatically competent because that's a usage pattern in some dialects. So, try to not think of grammar as an English term as far as like grammar Nazi, right? And I hate that Nazis are still in the news, but if you're, a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, like if someone's a grammar Nazi," jokingly, right? So that's something to where they're more about the spelling rules, right? And spelling is very different from being communicatively competent, being able to express yourself, being able to use certain terms in your dialect that's grammatically valid in a language. So, as a linguist, I would say try to divulge yourself from saying something that has grammar is grammatically competent. because it subscribes to certain language rules which are really arbitrary, right? Try to think of grammar as something to where if there are patterns of a language and people are able to be communicatively competent, then it is grammatical. Remember, spelling and language are very, very, very different. So, what does grammar mean? When we talk about grammaticality, we mean that something can exist within the rules of the language. So that, for example, Blick, right? And prior to this, I didn't know that Blick was the name of an art supply store. So we're just gonna forget. We're gonna forget that Blick is a name, and just think of Blick as like a noun. So, we don't. Blick doesn't really. Besides using it as a name, Blick doesn't really mean anything. Like, oh, I'm gonna go pick up some Blick tomorrow. That doesn't really, that doesn't really make any sense, but it is grammatical because this is a structure that you'll see in English, right? What is ungrammatical is this one, Bannick, right? Bannick is ungrammatical, we would say, linguists would say, because this term, like there's no term in the English language that starts with a B, that has a B and an N together, right? So that we would say that it's ungrammatical. So even if you don't know, what a if you don't know what a word is, or even if the word doesn't exist in your language, you're able to understand whether or not it's grammatical based on your knowledge, your inner working of how um, words work in your language. So, for example, when I was a kid, there was a book that came out that was called Friendle, and it was this, these kids kind of made up this word for a pen, right? And they called it Friendle. And Friendle is something that's grammatical, right? Even though it doesn't really mean anything, it is within the confines. You can use it within English. So it's a little tricky, but I encourage you to use grammar in these terms instead of the spelling terms. So your textbook uses varieties, right, instead of dialects, but which we'll cover in a little bit. So they said it's a neutral term for a particular version of a language. But just, be careful because it's not inferior, it's not broken, it's not sloppy, right? So a lot of people say that like someone has broken English. And as a linguist, we would say, no, they just have a variety of English, right? Nothing is ever really broken. It just doesn't subscribe to the confines of particular language rules. So, for example, African American Vernacular English, also known as Black English, also known as Ebonics, although that term is very controversial. Southern English, for example, a lot of people say, like, oh, if you use the words like ain't and, that's ungrammatical, but it actually is, a variety. It's a dialect. Standard versus non-standard. Some people say, "Oh, are you using standard English?" Right. So that's what's considered to be the correct or the prestigious form. Okay. If you're English, right? If you're from Britain, then you would say like something has received pronunciation. That's the standard as well. And so, something that is the standard might be socially considered to be this correct, but linguistically, it's not superior than these non-standard varieties. So, for example, speaking Southern English is valid, but also speaking British English is also valid. So, if you get anything from this lecture, just know that all types of varieties, all languages, all dialects, all varieties are grammatical. They're all valid. And to show, an example of a sentence that has grammatical competence but that has no communicative competence, which makes no, something that makes no sense, is when Chomsky said, he gave an example of this phrase, which is colorless green ideas sleep furiously. So what does that mean? Nothing. It means absolutely nothing, right? It makes no sense, but it has grammatical competence because it fits the confines of the rules of a language. So, for example, um, colorless is an adjective, green is an adjective, ideas is a noun. In English, we usually put the adjectives before a noun, right? Sleep is a verb. We usually put the subject, verb, object, right? There's no object in the sense, but here's a subject, here's a verb. Furiously, we know that's an adverb because it ends in ly, and we know that adverbs modify verbs, right? So, if you were to go to a person who doesn't speak English and you'd say, oh, yeah, like colorless green ideas, sleep furiously, they would say, oh, that sounds like English. I mean, any English speaker would know that doesn't make any sense, but just the grammatical notion um, of the sentences and the words all falling into place make it grammatical. Just like how Blick is grammatical, even though it doesn't mean anything, but Nick isn't grammatical because it violates the rules that we have for the English language. So, communicative competence enables us to convey and interpret messages and to negotiate meanings interpersonally within specific contexts. This includes, the roles of participants, the functions of interaction, and the information exchange. This is an example of which, people say you can be speaking the same language, but people do not understand each other, right? And that's because everything depends on the context, it depends on who you are, it depends on what's exchanged, it depends on, you know, um, what has happened before, right? So if someone were to come into the room and said, oh, it's really cold in here, right? Then the other person would say, "Oh, sorry, let me shut the window," right? So if that's their way of saying like, "Ooh, I'm really cold," right? But someone could also come into a room and say, "Oh, it's really cold in here," having witnessed like two people fighting right in the room before. So your communicative competence depends on the scenarios in which you have witnessed, the context or who these people are. Your knowledge of the situation kind of fuels your competence in this area. Communicative competence also reflects on, the validity of the languages that you speak. All speakers speak a dialect. You might not think that you speak a dialect, but you do. Like I just said, I spoke Southern English, and a lot of people say I don't sound Southern. But, there's some words I say are very Southern. And some people would say, like, yeah, I don't speak a dialect. And I would say, yeah, you sound like you're from Maryland. It just depends on whatever dialect that you say um that might be more standard. A lot of people consider the Midwest, right? But I can tell when someone is from the Midwest based on how they speak. No two people speak the same way, so everyone has what's called an idiolect, right? So it's not only that you sound different from people from different cities or different regions or different houses, but you also sound different as an individual. It's part of your communicative competence. And also, the language variety is based on various social factors. Um, how do you talk if you're a Gen Z or if you're a millennial, or if you're a boomer, right? What about your gender, ethnicity, region, class, all these contexts? Like, how did they impact the ways in which you speak? Linguists, we try to understand the rules of the system across these dimensions because we want to unpack, what are the power structures that underlie gender? How is it that what are some gender roles? Like how do they impact the ways in which people speak? How does someone's social class determine how they talk and how do they communicate with others? So I'm just going to go over a little bit about dialects, although, your text refers to them as varieties. But, a dialect in a language, people consider them to be very different. Some people consider them to be the same. One of my mentors, Walt Wolfram, he came up with this definition. A dialect is a neutral label that refers to a variety of language that's shared by a group of people, right? So, there's a meme about khakis, right? I lost my khakis, but in Boston it means car keys, right? I lost my car keys. And that's supposed to be like a joke on the Boston accent, but this is a dialect, and it can take the form of grammar, it can take the form of pronunciation, of different vocabulary, right? There's lots of different things to where, um, if I said the words chicken box or Old Bay to someone in North Carolina, they would say, "What are you talking about?" Right? Because those are very Maryland things. So, what is the difference between a dialect and a language? A lot of people say, "Oh, a dialect, or is a something that's mutually intelligible." Like, for example, British English and American English are just dialects of English because they can understand each other. Well, there's different examples of this. So, for example, you have flags from all these different countries. You have Denmark, you have Norway, you have Sweden, right? And a lot of people will say, these are different languages. Swedish language, Norwegian language, Danish language. But the reality is, all these different people from these different countries can speak their native language, and it would be the same thing as a British person and an American person speaking. So, does that make it a language? And then here's another example to where, Hindi and Pakistani language Urdu, right? Um, they're considered to be different languages, but a lot of people can understand them. So does that make them a dialect? Does that make them mutually intelligible? And on the opposite end, you have languages like Mandarin and Cantonese, and people will refer to them as different dialects of Chinese. But someone speaking Mandarin to me, I won't be able to understand. And someone speaking Cantonese to a Mandarin speaker, they won't be able to understand. So are they considered different dialects? What gives these different varieties the term dialect or language? And it all depends on power, really. It depends on how the country wants to establish itself. Maybe it wants to its people to be very Swedish. So you wouldn't say, "Oh, we speak Norwegian light," or "We speak the same language as the Danish." You would say, "No, we're Swedish. We speak the Swedish language," even though it's basically very similar to these other languages. Um, how would you pronounce these words? Mary, Mary, and Mary. To me, it sounds the same, right? Mary, Mary, and Mary. But a lot of people in Baltimore, they would say these very different. They would say Mary, Murray, Mary, right? Um, like fairy, furry, right? So they would pronounce it very differently. And so even within, these are different dialects within Maryland. A lot of people would also pronounce these differently as well. Pin, pen, creek, crick, caught, caught, and water, water. A lot of people from Western Maryland, closer to Pennsylvania, they might say water as wooder, right? Or creek as crick, right? Or like wash for wash, right? So these are different varieties, and remember, they're not inferior. There's no wrong language. There's no wrong dialect. A lot of people will pronounce coffee like coffee, right? So, that's something that's a variety of English. Maybe they're from Boston, maybe they're from New York. What is this object called? A lot of people would say shopping cart. A lot of people would say buggy. Sodas. A lot of people call this sodas. A lot of people call this pop, depending on where you're from. If you're from the Midwest, overwhelmingly you'll call it pop. If you're on the East Coast, you'll call it soda. A lot of places in the South, if you'll say, so for example, my friend from Georgia says, "Oh, do you got a Coke?" And he says, "Yeah, I got, Coke, I got Pepsi, I got Sprite," and you're like, "Okay, I asked for a Coke," right? But then Coke means the same thing as a soft drink, right? So, this is I don't want to say this is how our country is divided, but I would say this is the diversity of our country. What do you call it when the rain falls when the sun is shining? A lot of people wouldn't have anything to say. They would just say, "Yeah, it's raining and the sun is shining." But other people have different usages. So they would say a sun shower, or the wolf is giving birth, or the devil's beating his wife, which is kind of misogynist. But like some people have different ways of looking at things. The next lecture we're going to talk about, how that it affects, whether language affects thought. But this is a very interesting question. Like, what does it mean if you say something very different than another person? And so, I really like this quote by Max Weinreich. He says, "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." My friend also says and also an air force, because we might say something is a language, but it really is a different dialect, right? And we might say something is a dialect, but it's actually a language. And so something that if you give power to something, we would say, "Oh yeah, that's definitely a language." But dialects are just as valid. They're just as linguistically, grammatically correct as a language. It just all depends on who's in power and who gets to make the rules of a language. So, speaking on that, what do you think is a good language? What do you think is a bad language? What are some rules that you've heard or learned about language? And also consider where these ideas come from. In your linguistic autobiography, you can also talk about, were you ever policed? Did your parents do some of that? Did your teachers do some of that? Did they say, like, oh, don't say this? I grew up in a very religious area, and they said, never use the word, never use God in vain. And so I always use the word gosh, because I always was so scared of using the Lord's name in vain. So, so it might be very different, from being in Maryland. Some of the language rules that you probably learned are never end the sentence with a preposition, adjectives go before nouns, when to use who and whom, capitalize proper names, don't say ain't, don't say y'all, don't say wars, right? So these obviously have a little bit of a power context underneath them, right? Because this is something that of the whole region, of a whole group of people use y'all. What are you trying to say by saying don't use y'all? So there's certain rules about language, and we can characterize these rules by saying it's prescriptive versus descriptive. So the prescriptive usually comes from a higher power source, and this is where we're talking about what is good language, what is proper language, what's the standard language. This is the perceived received pronunciation, right? And this is the Queen's English or the King's English, right? So this is thoughts about how language is supposed to be used. Descriptive language is how people actually speak in the real world. Okay, so regardless of where your education is, your social ethnic background, your native language, not everyone speaks in standard English all the time. Some people code switch, especially if you're from an ethnic background. A lot of people use what we call, slang, right? They use different words. And so that's actually how language is actually spoken, is descriptive. And this is kind of giving an overview, right? Prescriptive, are rules that talk about how language should be used. This is how this is bad English versus good English, versus how is it that people really talk. This is what linguists mostly focus on. They look at the rules and the patterns and irregularities. Um, they describe and they try to understand the rules that speakers do in fact follow, and the truth is, all spoken language is governed by rules, right? So, this is where a lot of people, this is where my English self and my linguistic self kind of divide. Where like a lot of the textbooks say you should use this. So I try to tell my students, like, okay, well the textbook says this, but then as a linguist, I say, but all the ways of speaking are valid, right? So that would be descriptive versus prescriptive right there. So, what is the point? Me as a linguist, I'm telling you that descriptive is the way we try to go about it. But then, like, but why would people want to do prescriptive? Why would people want language rules? What's so good about them? Well, they can use it to sell usage manuals. I can't tell you what edition of APA we're at, American Psychological Association. I think we're on the 16th, right? But there's money to be made in books that say, write MLA, write in APA, write in this style, Chicago style, right? There's nothing bad about it per se, but it is a way for them to standardize, right? Because you don't want people writing in all these different styles. You want to be able to understand what people are trying to say, right? Um, and we also want to understand, what are the rules and why are you making the rules? If you're saying don't use this term, who mostly uses this term? Is it the youth? Is it ethnic youth? Right? Is it females? Right? So it's like what is society trying to tell you by saying don't use this? I also really like this quote from Fasold and Linton. Linguists approach language in the same way that astronomers approach the study of the universe or that anthropologists approach the study of human and cultural systems. It would be ridiculous for astronomers to speak about planets orbiting stars incorrectly and inappropriate for anthropologists to declare a culture degenerate simply because it differs from their own. Similarly, linguists take language as they find it, rather than attempting to regulate it in the direction of a preconceived criteria. Linguists are equally curious about all forms of language that they encounter, no matter the education or social standing of a speaker may be. And I really like this quote because, I'm from the South, and a lot of people think that Southern English says that you are uneducated, right? And as you can see from my background, I'm very educated, but I still speak Southern English, right? So I think people have these misconceptions about, where you're from and what that says about you. That is very tied to stereotypes, right? And is not actually connected to truth, right? You can speak a certain dialect and still be articulate and still be, um, smart, intelligent, right? What does this word even mean, articulate, right? So these are questions that we will consider in this course. So the takeaways from my classes: everyone speaks a variant of language. You all speak some sort of variant. You all speak a dialect, right? And often these languages that you speak, these dialects that you speak, are a reflection of your own identities. They tell you where you're from and where your values are, and your region, your age, your gender, your sex, your ethnicity. Natural language use is very different than prescriptive language rules, right? Don't use this or don't use this. The ways in which language occurs naturally is valid and has its own grammatical rules. They have their own grammar. They're completely linguistically valid. So there's no such thing as an inferior language, right? I'm using that in quotes, even though you can't see. So that is the bulk of our first lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Your first assignment is to go and upload your linguistic autobiography onto Blackboard on the discussion board post. So I say upload, but really you'll post your linguistic autobiography and comment onto others. Thanks, and I'll see you for our next lecture.